My name is Ruby. I'm 46 years old, and 2 years ago I decided to return to work after what was supposed to be a short maternity leave. Life had other plans. One child became two. Then there were school schedules, illnesses, family routines, and before I knew it, 9 years had passed. Financially, I didn't need a job. My husband works for a major IT company and earns more than enough for our family. Whenever I mentioned going back to work, he would ask the same question. Why put yourself through all that stress? The truth was simple. I miss being useful. Not in the way parents are useful. I loved my children more than anything. But I miss projects, deadlines, office conversations, solving problems, and finishing a task knowing it mattered to someone beyond my own household. I missed the version of myself that existed before my entire identity became mom. Going back to my old company wasn't an option. Nobody keeps a position open for 9 years, and honestly, I didn't want them to. I wanted a challenge. I wanted something new. At least that's what I thought. The reality hit me much harder than I expected. The first few weeks of job searching were exciting. I updated my resume, watched tutorials, completed online courses, and practiced interviews. Then came the rejections. Lots of them. Some companies never replied. Some politely informed me they had chosen candidates with more recent experience. Others conducted interviews that seemed promising before disappearing completely. One recruiter actually asked me, "Can you explain the 9-year gap in your employment history?" As if I had spent nearly a decade hiding in a cave. After the first month, I was still optimistic. After the third month, I was worried. After the sixth month, I started wondering if I had made a mistake. Technology had moved forward while I was busy raising children. Processes had changed. Software had changed. Entire job titles existed now that hadn't even been invented when I left the workforce. I felt like someone trying to rejoin a conversation that had been going on for hours. Every day I would send applications. Every day I would receive silence. My confidence slowly evaporated. The worst part wasn't the rejection. It was the feeling that nobody even wanted to give me a chance. One afternoon, after receiving another generic rejection email, I closed my laptop and stared at the wall in my home office. Maybe employers saw my age and moved on. Maybe they saw the career gap. Maybe both. For the first time, I seriously considered giving up. I remember telling my husband over dinner, "I don't think anyone's going to hire me." He looked genuinely surprised. "Ruby, you've always been good at what you do." That was 9 years ago. It's still you. I appreciated the encouragement, but encouragement doesn't create job offers. A week later, something unexpected happened. I received a call from a recruiter. Not an email. An actual phone call. The company was called Nexacore Solutions. The recruiter sounded excited. Almost unusually excited. She told me they were growing rapidly, opening new departments, hiring aggressively, and looking for experienced professionals who could bring maturity and leadership to younger teams. For the first time in months, someone sounded interested in me rather than concerned about my employment gap. The interview process moved incredibly fast. Too fast looking back. I had an initial phone screening on Monday, a video interview on Wednesday, a final interview with senior management on Friday. The following Tuesday, they offered me the job. I remember reading the offer letter 3 times because I couldn't believe it. The salary wasn't extraordinary, but that didn't matter. I wasn't doing this for money. What mattered was that someone had finally said yes. When I accepted the offer, I felt like I had won a marathon. My first day arrived 2 weeks later. The office occupied 3 floors of a modern glass building downtown. The lobby looked expensive. The reception area looked expensive. Even the coffee machines looked expensive. Everything about the place screamed success. I remember walking through the office and thinking that this was exactly what I had been hoping for. People seemed energetic. Teams were collaborating. Meeting rooms were full. Large monitors displayed company metrics on walls. Employees carried laptops while rushing between departments. The entire place felt alive. My manager, Olivia, greeted me warmly. She was in her late 30s, confident, charismatic, and seemed to know everyone. Within the first hour, she had introduced me to at least 20 people. Most of them appeared genuinely friendly. My immediate team consisted of 7 employees. There was Marcus, the senior analyst who had been with the company for 3 years. Jenna, a project coordinator. Alex, who handled reporting, Sophia from operations, two junior analysts named Ethan and Lily, and me. At lunch, everyone gathered around a large table in the break room. The conversations flowed naturally. People joked with one another. Nobody treated me like the older newcomer. For the first time since returning to the workforce, I felt like I belonged somewhere. That feeling lasted exactly 3 weeks. The first crack appeared during a routine team meeting. It was small enough that I almost ignored it. But looking back now, that was the moment I should have paid attention. Because that tiny crack would eventually reveal that the entire company was built on something far less solid than anyone realized. And once I saw it, I couldn't stop seeing it. Hashtag. The first crack appeared during a Monday morning meeting. At the time, it seemed insignificant. Olivia was presenting quarterly performance results to our department. Various teams had prepared reports, analyses, forecasts, and recommendations. Hours of work had gone into those documents. Marcus had spent 2 weeks building predictive models. Jenna had coordinated data collection from 3 departments. I had personally reviewed and corrected dozens of pages before the presentation. When the meeting ended, I expected discussions about implementation. Instead, the executives thanked everyone for their hard work and immediately moved on to an entirely different topic. None of our recommendations were discussed. None of the conclusions mattered. Nobody even referenced the report again. First, I assumed that was normal. Not every piece of work leads to immediate action. But then it happened again. And again. And again. Over the following weeks, I started noticing a strange pattern. Teams were constantly busy. Everyone had deadlines. Everyone attended meetings. Everyone produced reports. Everyone submitted presentations. Yet I could never identify what any of it was actually accomplishing. One project would begin. Hundreds of hours would be spent on it. Then it would quietly disappear. A month later, a nearly identical project would appear under a different name. The cycle repeated endlessly. The oddest part was that nobody seemed concerned. One afternoon, I asked Alex a simple question while we were reviewing a dashboard. What happened with the customer optimization project from last quarter? He looked at me for a second, then shrugged. No idea. You worked on it. I know. So what was the outcome? Another shrug. They closed it. Why? No clue. Then he changed the subject. At first I thought he simply didn't know. Later I realized he didn't want to know. There was a difference. The more questions I asked, the stranger the responses became. People avoided specifics. Nobody could clearly explain how our work affected the company's products. Nobody could point to a client who benefited from our analyses. Nobody could show evidence that our recommendations had ever been implemented. Yet the company continued growing. Or at least that's what everyone claimed. Every month there were announcements about expansion. New departments. New hires. New contracts. New partnerships. But despite all that growth, I rarely saw anything tangible being created. There were no major product launches. No meaningful operational changes. No visible results. Just endless activity. Activity for the sake of activity. One day I was reviewing archived project documentation when I stumbled upon something unusual. Several projects from different departments contained almost identical reports. Not similar. Identical. Entire sections had been copied and pasted with only minor wording changes. Different teams. Different objectives. Different budgets. The same conclusions. The same charts. The same recommendations. I initially assumed it was laziness. Then I checked more files. The pattern kept appearing. That was when my professional instincts started screaming. I've always believed that busy and productive are 2 different things. Nexicor was incredibly busy, but I was beginning to suspect it wasn't productive at all. A few weeks later I had lunch with Marcus. Out of everyone on the team, he seemed the most competent. The kind of person who noticed things but rarely spoke about them. At some point I casually asked a question. Do you ever feel like we're creating reports nobody uses? He laughed. Not because it was funny, because he knew exactly what I meant. For several seconds he stared into his coffee. Then he said something that stayed with me. Ruby, have you ever wondered why nobody asks whether the work matters? I remember feeling a chill. What do you mean? People ask if the reports are finished. People ask if deadlines are met. People ask if presentations look good. He paused. But nobody asks if any of it serves a purpose. Before I could respond, he stood up. Lunch was over. The conversation never continued, but his words stayed in my head. That evening, after everyone left the office, I remained at my desk. I started reviewing internal records that were available to employees in my position. Nothing confidential. Nothing I wasn't authorized to access. I simply began paying closer attention, and what I found made even less sense. Department budgets were enormous. Consulting expenses were enormous. Contractor payments were enormous. The company spent money at a rate that seemed completely disconnected from its actual output. Certain external vendors appeared repeatedly. The names changed slightly from project to project, but the pattern remained. Large payments, vague descriptions, minimal documentation. Sometimes entire projects seemed to exist only on paper. I spent several nights digging through old files. The deeper I looked, the more uncomfortable I became. Eventually, I reached a conclusion that scared me. I no longer believed the company was merely inefficient. I believed much of the work itself existed solely to create the appearance of legitimate business activity. The reports, the meetings, the projects, the departments, everything looked real. Everything felt real. But the actual value being created was surprisingly difficult to find. And if the work itself was largely meaningless, then where was all the money going? That question began consuming me. I tried finding innocent explanations. Rapid expansion, poor management, corporate bureaucracy, anything. But every answer created two new questions. The most disturbing realization came slowly. People like me might not be the beneficiaries of whatever was happening. We might be the cover. Hundreds of employees showing up every day. Hundreds of employees producing endless paperwork. Hundreds of employees creating a perfect illusion of legitimate operations. Most of us probably had no idea. I certainly didn't. But if my suspicions were correct, our work served a purpose after all. Just not the purpose we thought. That realization left me staring at my computer long after the office had emptied. For the first time, I seriously considered taking my concerns to the authorities. But I knew one thing. Suspicion wasn't enough. I had no proof. No investigator would care about feelings. No police officer would open a case because something felt wrong. If I wanted answers, I needed evidence. Real evidence. And without fully realizing it, that was the moment I stopped being an employee and started becoming an investigator. The next morning, I walked into the office pretending everything was normal. Inside, nothing was normal anymore. Once you start noticing inconsistencies, it's impossible to stop. The same meetings, the same reports, the same cheerful conversations. But now I was paying attention to details. Who approved budgets? Who signed off on projects? Who avoided certain questions? Who seemed nervous when specific topics came up? I wasn't trying to play detective. At least that's what I told myself. I simply wanted proof that my suspicions were wrong. Unfortunately, the opposite happened. The more I looked, the more disturbing everything became. I started keeping notes. Nothing dramatic. Just observations. Project names. Dates. Vendor names. Budget amounts. People involved. Patterns. At first, I stored everything in a spreadsheet on my personal laptop at home. Every evening after work, I would sit in my office and review what I had gathered during the day. My husband noticed immediately. "You've become obsessed." He wasn't entirely wrong. I had become obsessed. Not because I wanted to expose anyone. Because I wanted an explanation. I needed one. People don't spend millions of dollars on projects that accomplish absolutely nothing. Not by accident. Not repeatedly. One Friday evening, I stumbled upon the first piece of information that genuinely frightened me. I was reviewing project archives when I noticed several vendor companies sharing nearly identical contact information. Not exactly identical. Close enough to raise questions. The addresses were different. The company names were different. But certain phone numbers appeared repeatedly. The same accounting contacts appeared repeatedly. The same approval chains appeared repeatedly. It was as if different companies were somehow connected behind the scenes. I copied the information into my notes. The following week I noticed something else. Several large projects had supposedly involved external consultants. Very expensive consultants. The company had paid substantial amounts for their services. Yet nobody on my team had ever spoken to them. Nobody had attended meetings with them. Nobody could explain what they had actually delivered. When I asked Jenna whether she had worked with one particular consulting firm, she frowned. I've seen their name. Did you ever meet anyone from there? No. Did they provide reports? I don't think so. Then what did they do? She laughed. I have no idea. The answer bothered me. Not because she didn't know. Because she didn't seem interested in knowing. That attitude existed throughout the company. Questions died quickly. Curiosity disappeared quickly. People focused on their assigned tasks and ignored everything else. The more I thought about it, the more I wondered whether that was intentional. Maybe most employees weren't stupid. Maybe they had simply learned that asking questions led nowhere. Or worse, a month into my unofficial investigation, something happened that changed everything. Marcus approached my desk. He looked around before speaking. It was subtle, but unusual enough that I noticed. Can we talk after work? My stomach tightened. Sure. That evening we met in a small coffee shop several blocks away from the office. For the first few minutes, neither of us mentioned work. Then Marcus leaned forward. I know what you've been doing. My heart nearly stopped. What do you mean? Looking into the company. I considered denying it. Instead, I asked the obvious question. How do you know? Because I did the same thing. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket. On it were dozens of names, companies, projects, departments, dates, years of notes, years. I stared at him. How long have you been tracking this? Almost 2 years. 2 years. I felt sick. Why haven't you reported it? Marcus looked exhausted. The kind of exhausted that doesn't come from lack of sleep. The kind that comes from carrying something heavy for a very long time. Because I couldn't prove anything. He pointed at the paper. I could see the pattern. I just couldn't connect all the pieces. For the next 2 hours we compared notes. The overlap was astonishing. We had independently identified many of the same projects. Many of the same vendors. Many of the same executives. By the end of the conversation, one thing became clear. Neither of us believed the company's operations were legitimate. Not entirely. The real question was how deep the deception went. Then Marcus told me something I hadn't discovered. 3 former employees had disappeared from the company over the previous 18 months. Not physically disappeared. They had simply left. Abruptly. No farewell emails. No goodbye lunches. No announcements. One day they were there. The next day they were gone. Each of them had worked in departments connected to financial oversight. Each of them had asked uncomfortable questions, at least according to Marcus. That information stayed with me all weekend. By Monday morning I viewed everyone differently, especially management, especially Olivia. For months I had considered her one of the good ones. Now I wasn't sure. Was she involved? Was she another employee being used? Did she know? I couldn't tell. Then came the moment that convinced me I was getting too close. One afternoon, Olivia called me into her office. Nothing unusual about that. Managers do that all the time. What was unusual was her expression. She closed the door, then sat across from me. For several seconds she said nothing. Finally she smiled. A polite smile. A careful smile. Ruby, you've been taking a strong interest in company operations. Every alarm bell in my head started ringing. I forced a smile. I like understanding how things work. She nodded. That's one of the reasons we hired you. Another pause. Then she said something I'll never forget. Sometimes it's best to focus on your own responsibilities. The sentence sounded harmless, but it didn't feel harmless. Felt like a warning. A very professional warning. I left her office trying to appear calm. Inside I was terrified. Because for the first time I realized something important. If I could see what was happening, then people higher up could probably see me. And if that was true, my investigation was no longer secret. Which meant I had less time than I thought. For months, I had been trying to determine whether something illegal was happening. Now I had a new problem. Someone inside the company might already know I was looking, and I still didn't have the one thing that mattered most. Proof. Real proof. The kind that could survive scrutiny. The kind that could bring investigators through the front door. The kind that could finally reveal what Nexicor was actually hiding behind all those reports, meetings, and fake projects. And deep down, I knew my next move would determine whether this ended with answers, or with me becoming the fourth employee to suddenly disappear. For the next several weeks, Marcus and I became extremely careful. We stopped discussing anything inside the office. No emails. No chat messages. No phone calls. If we needed to talk, we met outside work. Usually in crowded places. Coffee shops. Public parks. Restaurants. Anywhere that felt safer than the office. By then, I was convinced that Nexicor wasn't simply a poorly managed company. The entire organization seemed designed to create the appearance of legitimate business activity. The employees weren't the beneficiaries. We were the scenery, the backdrop, the proof that a real business supposedly existed. The problem was that suspicion still wasn't evidence. Then, completely by accident, we found the missing piece. It happened during a routine budget reconciliation project. One of the senior finance managers unexpectedly resigned. His responsibilities were temporarily distributed across several departments. A small portion of his workload landed on my desk. Nothing unusual. Nothing confidential beyond my authorization level. But for the first time, I gained visibility into records that had previously been handled elsewhere. That was where everything fell apart. Several supposedly independent vendor companies were receiving enormous payments. Millions of dollars. The paperwork looked legitimate at first glance. Invoices. Contracts. Project descriptions. Approval records. But when I started comparing them side by side, patterns emerged. The same language appeared repeatedly. The same formatting. The same approval sequence. The same individuals authorizing transactions through different departments. It looked less like independent vendors and more like someone had copied the same template dozens of times. I spent 3 days checking records. Then 3 more. Then an entire weekend. By Monday morning, I was staring at something I couldn't ignore. Money was moving in circles. Not literally, but close enough. Funds entered one company, passed through multiple vendors, returned through different channels. Every step disguised beneath layers of fake projects, consulting agreements, and fabricated business activity. Suddenly everything made sense. The endless reports. The meaningless projects. The constant hiring. The departments that produced nothing. The consultants nobody had ever met. The work wasn't the purpose. The work was camouflage. For several minutes, I simply sat at my desk staring at the screen. I remember thinking about all the employees around me. People answering emails. People preparing presentations. People worrying about deadlines. Most of them had absolutely no idea. Neither had I. The realization was horrifying. Thousands of hours of honest work had been used to make something fraudulent appear legitimate. That evening, Marcus and I met immediately. I showed him everything. Every document. Every payment trail. Every connection. When he finished reviewing the files, he looked pale. Neither of us spoke for a while. Finally, he said what both of us were thinking. This is enough. And for the first time, I agreed. We weren't investigators. We weren't auditors. We weren't prosecutors. Our job wasn't to prove every detail. Our job was to hand over what we had discovered. The following week, we contacted federal authorities through official whistleblower channels. Very carefully. Very quietly. We submitted documentation. Timelines. Financial records. Internal communications. Project histories. Everything we had collected. Then we waited. Waiting turned out to be the hardest part. For nearly 2 months, nothing happened. At least nothing visible. Life inside Nexicor continued as usual. Meetings. Reports. Presentations. Fake urgency. Fake productivity. The same performance. Then one Tuesday morning, everything changed. I arrived at work just before 8. The parking lot was full of vehicles I had never seen before. Several people wearing identification badges were entering the building. Others were already inside. Within minutes, rumors spread across every floor. government investigators, financial crime units, search warrants, audits, interviews. Nobody knew exactly what was happening, but everyone knew something enormous had begun. The atmosphere transformed instantly. Executives who normally appeared calm suddenly looked terrified. Managers disappeared into conference rooms. Legal teams arrived. Phones rang non-stop. People whispered in hallways. Some employees cried. Others simply sat in stunned silence. Around noon, Olivia walked past my desk. For the first time since I had known her, she looked completely defeated. She didn't say a word. Neither did I. Over the following months, the truth emerged. Nexacor had never been the thriving business it claimed to be. A small group of executives and outside partners had built an elaborate financial machine, hidden behind the appearance of legitimate corporate activity. Most employees had no involvement whatsoever. Most had no knowledge whatsoever. They had simply come to work every day. Just like me. The investigations continued for more than a year. Several executives were arrested. Others faced criminal charges. Numerous shell companies were exposed. Millions of dollars were traced through complex networks of transactions. News outlets covered the story extensively. Former employees were interviewed. Regulators became involved. The entire organization eventually collapsed. When the dust settled, I expected to feel victorious. Instead, I mostly felt sad. Sad for the people who had genuinely believed in the company. Sad for the employees who lost their jobs overnight. Sad for the years some people had devoted to something that was never real. A few months later, Marcus and I met for coffee again. This time, neither of us was investigating anything. Neither of us was worried about being watched. The company was gone. The illusion was gone. Everything was finally over. At one point, he laughed and asked a question. "Do you regret taking the job?" I thought about it carefully. The answer surprised even me. No. He raised an eyebrow. After everything? I nodded. Because 6 months of rejection convinced me nobody wanted me anymore. I smiled. And this experience reminded me exactly who I am. The company turned out to be a lie. The projects were a lie. The growth was a lie. The success was a lie. But one thing wasn't. I had spent 9 years away from the workforce wondering whether I still had value. Whether my instincts still worked. Whether my experience still mattered. In the end, those instincts were exactly what uncovered the truth. Looking back now, I sometimes think the biggest lesson wasn't about fraud. It wasn't about money. It wasn't even about corruption. It was about paying attention. Because sometimes the most dangerous lies aren't hidden. They're standing in plain sight. Surrounded by hundreds of people. Protected by routine. Protected by paperwork. Protected by the simple assumption that if everyone acts like something is real, then it must be. And that's exactly how an entire company became one giant bubble. And how it eventually burst.